They didn't knock. They never do when they want to make sure you understand who holds the power. The man in the black coat simply walked onto Clara Mercer's porch at 7 in the morning while she was still pulling on her boots and dropped a folded document on the wooden railing like it was a piece of trash he was done carrying. He didn't say a word. He just looked at her with the kind of eyes that have delivered bad news so many times they stopped feeling it, turned around, and left. Clara picked up the paper with flour-dusted hands. The words Western Dominion Syndicate were printed at the top in bold black letters. Below them, 2 words she would never forget for the rest of her life. Vacate immediately. 72 hours. That was all they were giving her. 72 hours to pack up everything she and Elias had spent 11 years building from nothing. If you've ever stood on land you love and been told it is no longer yours, you already know the particular way the ground shifts beneath your feet. Not physically, but something inside you simply drops, and nothing catches it. This is Clara's story. And if you stay until the end, I promise you, she doesn't go quietly. Before we go any further, if you're new here, please consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And when you reach the end of this video, I'd love for you to drop a comment telling me the city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far Clara's story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. Clara Mercer had not slept well in months. That was the first thing people who knew her would have told you. Not that she was stubborn, not that she was quiet, not that she had the kind of steadiness that made people feel safer just by being near her. They would have told you she hadn't slept well since Elias died, and that showed on her in ways she couldn't entirely hide. She was 34 years old. She was full-figured in a way that she had spent most of her 20s learning to stop apologizing for. She had strong hands, the kind that come from real work and not the gym, and she had a habit of pressing her lips together when she was thinking hard, which meant she walked around most of the day with her lips pressed together. She had loved Elias Mercer with the kind of love that doesn't announce itself. It just shows up every morning and does the work. He had been the one to find the land, a 640-acre stretch of grassland and creek bed in the Durango territory, back when they were both 22 and reckless enough to believe that 2 people with calloused hands and a shared stubbornness could make something out of almost nothing. They had been right. Barely. The first 3 years were so hard that Clara's mother had begged her to come home. Clara stayed. She always stayed. Elias died from a chest infection that turned bad in the winter, the year Clara was 32. She had sat with him through the last 4 nights, holding his hand, not saying much because neither of them were people who talked just to fill silence. When it was over, she had stood up, walked outside into the frozen morning, and stood there for a long time. Then she came back inside, made coffee, and started figuring out what came next. She had been figuring that out for almost 2 years when the man in the black coat walked onto her porch. She read the document 3 times, standing right there on the porch, boots still only halfway laced, the cold morning air cutting through her flannel shirt. Boone sat beside her, watching her face the way dogs do when they can feel something has gone wrong. He was a German shepherd, 7 years old, with a scar on his left ear from a wire fence incident she still felt guilty about. He pressed his head against her thigh, and she didn't reach down to touch him. She was still reading. The language in the document was designed to confuse. She understood enough to know that. Legal language almost always is. But buried inside 3 paragraphs of impenetrable phrasing, she found the core of it. An obscure mineral rights covenant. Language tucked inside the original land grant from 30 years before Elias had ever set foot on the property. A clause that gave priority claim over subsurface resources to any registered corporation that could demonstrate a geological interest. Western Dominion Syndicate had registered that interest. The covenant had apparently been valid the entire time. Clara had never been told about it. Elias had never been told. The attorney who'd handled the sale, a man named Boland who'd died 3 years back, had either missed it entirely or never mentioned it. 72 hours. Clara put the document down on the railing. She walked to the end of the porch and looked out across the land, at the pasture rolling out toward the creek, the cattle standing in the early morning cold, the barn she and Elias had repaired board by board the second summer they were here. Elias had fallen off the roof of that barn. She had climbed up after him and they had argued about it for 20 minutes before either of them looked at his ankle to see if it was broken. It wasn't. But she had been so scared, and she had hidden it behind the argument because that was how she handled being scared. She pressed her lips together now, hard. She went back inside and picked up the telephone. The first attorney she reached told her there was nothing to be done. He said mineral rights covenants of that era were airtight, especially when they involved an organization the size of Western Dominion. He said he was sorry for her trouble. He didn't sound sorry. The second attorney was blunter. He told her that Western Dominion Syndicate had successfully used this particular legal strategy 11 times in the past 7 years. He said the territorial courts had consistently upheld the covenants. He also said, lowering his voice slightly, that he could not take her case. When she asked why, he said he had other clients to think about. She understood what that meant. The third call went to her neighbor, a rancher named Holt, who was 70 years old and had seen things in this territory that Clara had only heard stories about. He listened to everything she told him without interrupting, which was one of the reasons she trusted him. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "How much cash do you have?" he asked. She told him. Another pause. "Clara, I'm not going to tell you it's going to be all right, because I don't know that it is. What I'm going to tell you is that you need to move fast. You stop moving, they win. That's how they work." She pressed her lips together. "I know how they work, Holt." "I know you do." He paused again. "I'm sorry about Elias. I know I said that before, but I mean it again now." She thanked him and hung up. The next 48 hours were the kind of hours that age a person. Not the dramatic kind of aging that happens in stories, where someone's hair goes white overnight. The quiet kind. The kind where you move through tasks that need doing with the steadiness that looks like calm and isn't. She sold the cattle first. There were 63 head, and she accepted a price that she knew was obscene, knew was taking advantage of the situation, but she had no leverage and no time to find a better buyer. The man who came to collect them barely looked at her. The horses were worse. There were 4 of them. She had raised 2 from foals. She told herself not to think about that while she signed the papers. By the second night, she had packed what she could fit into the truck. Practical things, mostly. Documents, tools, her winter coat, the box of Elias's papers she had never been able to bring herself to go through. A photograph of the 2 of them from the second year, standing in front of the half-finished barn, both of them dirty and squinting into the sun. She put that in last, on top of everything. Boone watched her carry things to the truck all evening without getting in her way. He seemed to understand that this was not the time to need anything. That night she slept in the house for the last time. She didn't cry. She wasn't built for crying easily, and even if she had been, there was something about the depth of this particular grief that sat below the level where tears reach. It was too large for tears. It just settled in and made itself at home. In the morning, she drove to the land office. She had the deed, the original survey maps, and the eviction notice. She had everything organized in a manila folder, every page in order. The clerk behind the counter was a young woman who looked at Clara's folder with the cautious expression of someone who had been instructed not to let certain conversations go too long. "I need to file a challenge to this covenant," Clara said. She put the folder on the counter. The clerk opened it, glanced at the document from Western Dominion, and something shifted in her face. Not guilt exactly, more like recognition. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "challenges to registered mineral rights covenants have to go through territorial court, and the filing fee is—" Clara already knew the filing fee. She had looked it up. It was more than she had left after selling the cattle and the horses. She stood there for a moment with her hands flat on the counter. "All right," she said. She picked up her folder. She walked out. She sat in the truck for a long time without starting it. Boone was in the passenger seat. He turned to look at her, and she looked back at him, and eventually she put her forehead on the steering wheel. "I don't know what to do," she said out loud. She had not said that in 2 years, not since the morning after Elias died. Boone put his nose against her shoulder. She sat up, wiped her face with the back of her hand, started the truck. The idea of the cabin came from a handwritten notice pinned to the bulletin board at the general store in town. She had stopped there out of habit to buy a tin of coffee and some dried beans, and she had seen it while she was waiting, a small piece of paper, the ink slightly faded, offering for sale a hunter's cabin inside Blackthorn Forest, 43 miles northwest. No details except the price. $45. She thought about it for the rest of the drive. She did the arithmetic she had already done too many times. She thought about Holt's advice. You stop moving, they win. She turned the truck northwest. The road into Blackthorn Forest was barely a road. It was more like a suggestion that people had made repeatedly until the ground gave up and compressed itself into parallel ruts. The trees on either side were old growth, the kind that make everything else feel temporary, which Clara found either comforting or unbearable depending on the moment. The cabin appeared at the end of a clearing that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in a decade, which turned out to be accurate. It was small. One main room, a back corner that might generously be called a second room, a fireplace that had been built by someone who knew what they were doing, even if they couldn't be bothered to sweep it in the last 10 years. The roof had a soft spot on the north end. Two of the windows were cracked. There was a smell of old wood and something she couldn't identify that she chose not to investigate too closely. The man who sold it to her was a clerk from the county registrar's office who had inherited it from an uncle and couldn't tell her anything about its history except the uncle's name. Silas Vane. An old recluse, the clerk said, with the particular tone people use when they mean to say eccentric but are being polite about it. Died 5 years back. No one had wanted the property. Too far in, no water access except a creek half a mile east, no road to speak of. Clara paid the $45 in cash. It took almost everything she had left. She drove back to the cabin alone, with Boone and her truck full of everything she owned. Standing in front of it in the late afternoon light, she thought, this is what the bottom looks like. Not with despair exactly, just recognition. She had been trying to figure out what the bottom looked like for 2 years, and now she knew. She pushed open the door, let Boone inside first, and followed him in. The first week was about basic survival, which left no room for the quieter kind of pain. She fixed the worst leak in the roof with materials from the truck and some timber she found stacked beside the cabin. She swept the place out. She found a hand pump at the back of the property that still worked if you primed it properly, and she spent one long afternoon getting it to cooperate. She cooked on the fireplace and ate without much appetite, and at night she lay on the bedroll she'd brought and listened to Blackthorn Forest settle into darkness. It was not a quiet forest. It made sounds she catalogued carefully over those first nights. Wind in the canopy, which she'd expected. A creek somewhere to the east, which she'd known about. Something larger moving through the underbrush on the second night, which turned out to be a deer, and which Boone tracked with his nose through the closed door for 20 solid minutes. She found Silas Vane's ledger on the third day, tucked behind a loose stone in the back wall. It was a plain cloth-bound notebook, water-stained at the edges, the handwriting small and meticulous, the kind of writing that belongs to someone who spent time thinking about every word before it went on the page. She opened it expecting household accounts. That was what it looked like at first. Entries for firewood, flour, oil, trap supplies, the ordinary arithmetic of a man living alone in a forest. But she was tired and she was bored and she read forward, and the entries began to change. There were names she didn't recognize at first. Abbreviations. References to properties she couldn't place. Numbers that didn't add up to anything a cabin in the woods should need. She turned to the most recent dated entries, which were from 4 years before Silas Vane died. And there, in that same small, deliberate handwriting, she read 3 letters that made her sit down very suddenly on the cold floor. Or WDS Western Dominion Syndicate. She sat there with the ledger open in her lap and the fire going and Boone asleep by the hearth. And for the first time since the man in the black coat had dropped that notice on her railing, she felt something other than grief and exhaustion. She felt the particular sharpening of attention that happens when something shifts. She turned back to the beginning and started reading more carefully. It took her 3 days to get through the ledger properly, not because it was long, but because she kept stopping to cross-reference entries against the survey maps she'd brought with her. Elias's maps, the ones he'd spent years drawing himself because he had never trusted the official county surveys. He had always insisted the official boundaries were wrong. She had loved him enough to believe him and been too practical to think it mattered. She was beginning to think it mattered. The ledger references were deliberately indirect. Silas Vane had clearly known he was keeping records that someone might find dangerous, and he had written in a way that required work to decode. But the picture that emerged slowly over those 3 days of reading by firelight was not abstract. WDS appeared in connection with land parcels, with legal filings, with names of territorial officials. There were entries that described what she could only read as payoffs, written in careful euphemism, amounts transferred to people who had no business receiving money from a hermit in a forest. There were entries that connected specific survey alterations to specific dates. On the evening of the third day, she found the entry that made her stop breathing for a moment. The parcel number. She recognized it instantly. She had memorized that number the way people memorize their own phone numbers or their children's birthdays. It was the parcel number of the Mercer Ranch. Next to it, a date, 14 years ago, and a notation, boundary alteration confirmed. Mineral corridor widened 340 yards east. New filings registered. JB confirms no challenge anticipated. JB. She stared at it. JB, the attorney who'd handled their land purchase, Boland, who had died 3 years ago. Elias had known. He had been saying it for years, every time she told him gently that perhaps the surveys were close enough. He had said the boundaries were wrong, that the eastern line wasn't where the county said it was, that there was something off about the whole measurement. She had thought he was fixating. She had thought it was the way some people grieve that they can't let certain things go. He had been right. He had been right, and he had died not knowing that anyone would ever find out. Clara Mercer sat in a dead man's cabin in the middle of a forest in the dark, with her dog asleep by the fire, and she felt the weight of what she was holding. Then she turned back to the ledger and kept reading, because there were entries she still hadn't reached, and something told her the most important things were still ahead. What she found next was hidden at the back of the ledger, in pages she had initially glanced at and dismissed as blank. They weren't blank. They were written in a different ink, lighter, and the handwriting was different too, more cramped, written fast, like someone setting down thoughts they were afraid of having time to second guess. And tucked between two of those pages, there was something she hadn't expected, a small folded note, 4 lines. And below them, a sequence of numbers. She unfolded the note and read it once. Then she turned to look at the iron trap door, because that was when Boone stopped sleeping. That was when he got up from his place by the fire and walked to the stone beneath the fireplace and began to scratch. Boone didn't scratch at things without reason. That was one of the first things Clara had learned about him, back when he was a puppy, and she'd been skeptical of the particular intelligence people attributed to German shepherds. He didn't bark at shadows. He didn't dig at the floor because he was bored or anxious. When Boone paid sustained attention to something, it was because something was there. She watched him for a moment without moving. He was scratching at the large flat stone directly beneath the firebox. Not the hearthstones around it, not the floor beside it, but that specific stone, the one she had noticed on her first day because it was slightly larger than the others, and set at a faint angle that didn't quite match the surrounding masonry. She had thought it was just uneven settling. Old cabins settled. Everything in Blackthorn Forest was old and settling. Boone looked back at her once. Then he went back to scratching. Clara got up from the floor where she'd been sitting with the ledger and crossed the room. She crouched beside him and pressed her palm flat against the stone. It was cold, smoother than she expected, and when she pressed the left edge of it, just slightly, she felt something that a stone set in mortar should not do. It gave. Not much. A 1/4 inch, maybe less. But it moved, and when it moved, there was a faint sound beneath the floor. Not a crack or a groan, but a mechanical sound. Something shifting that had been designed to shift. She pulled her hand back. Boone sat down and looked at her with his ears forward. "All right," she said quietly. "All right." She got the oil lamp from the table and brought it closer. On her knees now, she ran her fingers along the edges of the stone. The mortar around 3 sides of it was real. But the 4th side, the back edge, the one closest to the firebox itself, had a different texture. She scraped at it with her thumbnail. It crumbled slightly. Not mortar. Something that looked like mortar but wasn't. Something that had been made to fill a gap, not to seal one. She went to the corner where she kept her tools and came back with a flathead screwdriver. She worked it slowly into the false seam. The material came away in dry flakes, and behind it she could see the edge of something metal. A bar, or a lever, fitted flush against the underside of the stone. It took her 20 minutes to clear enough of the false seam to get a proper grip on it. Her hands were already dry and cracked from the work of the past week, and this work made them worse. At one point she slipped and the screwdriver gouged the back of her knuckle. She swore, pressed the knuckle against her thigh for a moment, and kept going. When she finally got 2 fingers around the lever and pulled, it moved with the resistance of something that hadn't been touched in years. She had to brace her other hand against the hearth and pull steadily, not hard. the way you'd treat something old and possibly fragile. It moved another inch, then another. Then something beneath the floor released with a sound that was almost like a breath, a deep, compressed exhalation. And a seam appeared in the floorboards 18 inches to her left. A rectangular seam she hadn't seen before because it had been perfectly fitted and layered with dirt and time. An iron trapdoor. Hinged on one side, the hinge buried so cleanly in the floor that it was invisible until the door itself began to rise. Clara sat back on her heels and looked at it. Boone walked over and sniffed along the seam with the focused attention of an animal cataloging something completely new. "Don't go down there first," she told him. She got the lamp. She pulled the trapdoor fully open. It was heavier than it looked, and it didn't have a hold-open mechanism, so she propped it with the handle of the sledgehammer she'd been using on the roof repairs. The opening below was about 3 feet by 2 feet. A wooden staircase descended into darkness. The smell that came up was cold and dry and particular. The smell of sealed spaces, of air that hadn't moved in a very long time. She went down feet first, holding the lamp ahead of her, testing each step before she trusted it with her weight. There were 9 steps. Boone stayed at the top, watching her descend, and she could see the whites of his eyes in the lamplight. At the bottom, she held the lamp up and looked around. The room was small, maybe 8 feet by 10. The walls were stone, rough cut but solidly placed. The floor was packed earth, and against the far wall, taking up nearly a third of the available space, sat a steel vault. Old but serious, the kind that required intention and resources to install. Someone had brought it down here, or built the room around it, one or the other, and either way that was not a small undertaking. Clara stood in front of it for a long time. The vault had a combination dial, brass, tarnished almost black. It had no handle damage, no visible tampering. It had been sealed and left, and the only person who had known how to open it was Silas Vane, who had been dead for 5 years. She went back upstairs. She slept badly that night, which was not unusual, but this time the bad sleep had a different quality to it. Before, the nights had been heavy, the exhausted, dreamless weight of grief and physical labor. This night was restless. She kept coming back to the ledger, the vault, the notation next to Elias's parcel number, the folded note with the sequence of numbers. In the early morning, still dark, she gave up on sleep and lit the lamp and opened the ledger again to the back pages she'd found. The cramped, faster handwriting. She'd been so focused on the numbers that she hadn't read the surrounding text carefully enough. She read it now. Silas Vane had been, for at least part of his life, something other than a hermit. He had worked for Western Dominion Syndicate as a land surveyor. The back pages of the ledger were not accounts. They were a confession. Written in pieces over what Clara estimated to be several years, each entry dated, and each one adding something to a picture Silas had spent a long time being afraid to complete. He had been one of the men who altered the surveys. He didn't say this directly. He was careful even in what was apparently meant to be a private document, but the implications were unmistakable. He wrote about being instructed to adjust boundary lines. He wrote about filing documents that he knew contained deliberate errors. He wrote about a man named Gideon Rusk, who was identified only as GR throughout, but who Silas described as the person who gave the instructions and the person who made very clear what happened to men who developed inconvenient memories. Silas had kept records because he was afraid, not afraid enough to go to the authorities. He wrote about that too, about his conviction that the authorities were not a safe destination for what he knew, but afraid enough to document everything and hide it. He had put the most important records in the vault. He had designed the hiding mechanism himself. He had written the combination in the ledger in a way that he believed only someone who had read the entire document would recognize. Clara went back through the earlier entries. She was looking for a pattern now, not just content. Silas had embedded things. A literary reference here, a seemingly random date there. He had been educated, or had educated himself, which in her experience amounted to the same thing. He had been precise. It took her most of the morning, and 2 cups of weak coffee, and one significant false start that had her looking at the wrong set of numbers entirely. But when she found it, she recognized it immediately, the way you recognize something you've been looking for without quite knowing what it would look like when you found it. The combination wasn't a date or a numerical code. It was derived from a passage in a book. She recognized the passage itself, a fragment from a surveyor's manual she had seen a copy of in Elias's papers. and from the number of a specific section in the territorial land registry. Silas had assumed that whoever found the ledger would be someone with a reason to be looking, someone who understood land law and territorial documents. He had calibrated his hiding place for a specific kind of reader. He had written it for someone like Clara. She wasn't sure if that was comforting or disturbing. She decided it didn't matter. She worked out the combination on a piece of paper. She wrote it down. Then she went downstairs. The dial was stiff. The first attempt didn't work, and she stood there in the cold underground room, telling herself to be patient, which was not easy. She reset the dial slowly. Started again. 3 numbers to the right, 2 to the left, 1 to the right. She felt the mechanism engage at each step, felt it the way you feel a lock working. If you pay attention, a series of small internal yieldings. On the 3rd number of the second attempt, something clicked. The vault door weighed more than she expected, and it swung outward toward her on hinges that were stiff but functional. She stepped back and let it open fully. No gold. She hadn't actually been expecting gold, but the human brain makes certain imaginative leaps, and she noticed herself not being surprised, which meant she had been expecting something. What she found instead was shelves. 2 sets of shelves inside the vault, floor to ceiling, and on the shelves, stacked with a care that felt almost reverent, were ledgers. Leather-bound, labeled in that same small, meticulous handwriting, each one numbered and dated, dozens of them. She took the nearest one off the shelf, opened it. The pages were dense with figures and names and parcel numbers and dates. She took another. Same format, different years. She started at the earliest date she could find, which was 18 years ago, and began to read. She was still reading 3 hours later when Boone came down the stairs by himself to check on her. The records were methodical. That was what made them devastating. If they had been the notes of someone in a panic, someone disorganized by guilt, they would have been easier to discount. But Silas Vane had been a man who believed in precision, and the ledgers reflected that. Every transaction was recorded, every payment, every name, every parcel number, alongside its legal designation before the alteration and after. The Western Dominion Syndicate had been acquiring land for 18 years, and the method was consistent. Identify property that contained or abutted valuable mineral deposits. Locate or manufacture an obscure legal mechanism to challenge existing ownership. File the challenge through compliant officials, and apply pressure, financial, legal, and when necessary, other kinds, until the current owner had no choice but to yield. Clara cross-referenced entries against Elias's survey maps as she went, working back and forth between the vault ledgers and the papers she'd brought downstairs from the table. 3 properties in the first ledger matched parcels she recognized from the territorial registry filings she'd read. 5 more in the second ledger. By the 4th ledger, she stopped counting matches and started writing down the ones that didn't match, because it was a shorter list. Elias's parcel appeared in the 7th ledger. The entry was detailed, more detailed than most, which she took to mean that the mineral value was higher than average. The boundary alteration was described in specifics she hadn't seen in the earlier ledgers. The eastern line of the Mercer Ranch had been moved 340 yards. Not a clerical error. Not a measurement imprecision. 340 deliberate yards, taking a mineral corridor that ran below the surface of what had been their best eastern pasture. Elias had known. She said it out loud to herself in the cold underground room, not because she needed to hear it, but because saying it made it more real. He knew. He had walked that eastern line himself more than once. She remembered it. She had gone with him twice in the early years, while he explained what he thought was wrong. She hadn't understood the technical language, and she had nodded at what she hoped were the appropriate moments, and she had trusted him without fully following. He had been frustrated sometimes, not at her, but at the situation, at the inability to make anyone with authority take the discrepancy seriously. He had filed a complaint with the county survey office once, and it had been dismissed with a form letter. The form letter was probably in a file somewhere, probably signed by someone whose name appeared in one of these ledgers. Clara sat on the dirt floor of the underground room and held the 7th ledger in her lap and let herself be still for a minute. The lamp was burning low. She needed to go up and refill it. She didn't move yet. Boone put his head on her knee. He was right, she told him. The whole time. He was right. Boone didn't offer an opinion. He was good at that. She refilled the lamp and came back down. Well, It was in the 11th ledger that she found the entries that changed the nature of what she was looking at. Up to that point, the records documented fraud. Large-scale, systematic, deliberate fraud. The kind that required extensive coordination and corrupted officials, and probably a great deal of money paid to people whose job it was to prevent exactly this. That was serious. That was, if she could get it in front of the right eyes, potentially actionable. But the 11th ledger documented something else. The entries began with a property dispute that had apparently taken an unusual turn. A homesteader. The name was abbreviated, as most names were, but the initials were TH, and the parcel number was in the northwest section of the territory, had refused to comply with the syndicate acquisition order. Had in fact filed his own legal challenge, which should have been dismissed through the usual channels, but had somehow reached a judge who was not on the syndicate's list of reliable contacts. Silas had recorded the escalation in careful, indirect language. Matter referred to GR for resolution. Unconventional measures authorized. 3 entries later, a single line. TH situation resolved. Property transferred. No further complications anticipated. Clara read it twice. She read the entries around it. She thought about the phrase unconventional measures and what it would need to mean in order for a situation to be resolved in the way the next entry described. TH was dead. That was the only reading that made sense, or gone in a way that amounted to the same thing. She turned pages. There were 6 more similar entries over the span of the 11th and 12th ledgers. 6 situations that had escalated beyond the normal legal channels and been resolved through unconventional measures authorized by the man Silas called GR6 families. 6 homesteaders who had fought back in one way or another and then disappeared from the record. Clara was not a lawyer. She was not a law enforcement officer. She was a widow who had been evicted from her own land by the same organization whose records she was currently reading in a hidden room beneath a dead man's cabin. She understood that what she was holding had just become something different. Not a record of financial crimes, a record of something much worse. And then she reached the last entry in the 12th ledger, and she stopped. It was longer than the others. Several pages, written in the cramped fast hand of the back pages of the main ledger. The confession style, not the accounting style. Silas had departed from his usual precision and written something that read more like a letter, addressed to no one. He wrote about a woman named Anna Jensen. He wrote that she had been married to a farmer on the northeastern edge of the territory who had resisted a syndicate acquisition for 2 years and had died under circumstances that the territorial coroner had ruled accidental, but that Silas knew were not. He wrote that after the husband's death, Anna Jensen had continued to resist. She had written letters to federal authorities. She had contacted a newspaper. She had been warned, and she had not stopped. She had disappeared in the winter of a year, Silas noted carefully. Her property had transferred to the syndicate 3 months later through a legal mechanism that required her to have abandoned the claim. Silas wrote, "I know what happened to Anna Jensen. I know because I was present at the meeting where GR decided what would happen to her. I said nothing. I was afraid. And I said nothing. And I have carried that since. This is what I know." What followed was 3 pages of detail. Clara read every word. At the very end, tucked into the spine of the ledger, she found a small envelope. Inside the envelope was a silver locket, oval, tarnished, with a floral pattern pressed into the face of it. She opened it. Inside was a tiny photograph, barely the size of her thumbnail, of a woman and a young girl. On the back of the locket, scratched with something sharp, AJ. Do not let them win. Clara sat in the underground room for a long time after that. The lamp burned steadily. Boone was upstairs. She could hear him moving around above her, his nails on the wooden floor, and the ordinary sound of it was somehow steadying. She closed the locket in her palm. She thought about Elias. She thought about Anna Jensen, whose face she had just seen in a photograph the size of her thumbnail. She thought about TH and the 5 others who had become single lines in an accounting ledger. She thought about Silas Vane, who had been afraid and had done nothing but keep records, and who had arranged those records in a way that required someone like Clara to find them. She thought about what Holt had told her. You stop moving, they win. She had a vault full of evidence. She had survey maps that corroborated the land fraud entries. She had a dead woman's locket and a dead man's confession. She had, she realized slowly, something that Western Dominion Syndicate had spent 18 years making sure no single person ever had. She had the whole picture. The question was what to do with it. Because she was one woman in a forest. And this was an organization with enough money and influence to alter official records and silence federal complaints and have men disappear from the territorial rolls. She could not simply walk into a court and lay a ledger on the bench. She had tried the land office with a manila folder of legitimate documents and walked away with nothing. She needed someone who knew how to fight this kind of thing, someone who had reason to fight it and the skill to do damage with what she had. Someone who was either brave enough or reckless enough or angry enough that the size of Western Dominion Syndicate was not a reason to step back. She didn't know who that was yet, but she knew where to start looking. She also knew she couldn't leave the evidence here. If the Syndicate had any reason to suspect that Silas Vane had kept records, and she had to assume they'd considered the possibility, then this cabin was not a permanent safe location. She needed to move carefully. She needed to think through every step before she took it. She was good at that. Elias had always said she was the one who thought 3 steps ahead, while he was the one who moved. She had sometimes found that frustrating. Now it felt like the only asset she had. She went back to the main ledger, the confession pages. She reread the parts about the vault, about Silas's intentions for the records, about the condition he'd set for whoever found them. He had written, "If you have come this far, you are not here by accident. The records in the vault are complete. Everything that can be proven is in there. Everything that cannot be proven but is true is in the back of this ledger. Do not separate them. They need each other. She would not separate them." She spent the rest of that day making a precise inventory of everything in the vault, each ledger numbered, each date range noted, each major category of content flagged. She did this on paper, in her own handwriting, because she had learned from Elias that if something exists only in your memory, you can lose it, and she could not afford to lose any part of this. When she was done, she closed the vault and went upstairs. She cooked a thin meal and ate it without tasting it, and sat by the fire afterward, not reading, just thinking. There was one thing she had not yet understood. It came to her in the night, when she was almost but not quite asleep, and it sat her upright in the dark. The phantom ledger. Silas had used that phrase once in the confession pages, casually, as if referring to something the reader would already know about. The evidence in the phantom ledger supersedes what is in the vault. She had read it and passed over it, assuming it referred to one of the numbered ledgers she had already cataloged. But she had gone through every ledger in the vault twice now, and none of them were labeled with that phrase or any variant of it. None of them contained what she would call superseding evidence. They were all part of the same system, the same level of documentation. The phantom ledger was something else, something she hadn't found yet. She lay back down in the dark and stared at the ceiling of the cabin and went back through everything Silas had written in the confession pages. Protocol 11, Geological Safeguarding. That phrase had appeared twice. She had noted it and moved on, assuming it was syndicate terminology for one of their acquisition strategies. But what if it wasn't? What if it was a reference to something Silas had done, but a hiding protocol he had designed himself? He had designed the trapdoor mechanism. He had designed the combination. He was a man who thought in layers. Protocol 11 didn't mean a syndicate strategy. It meant a place. She was up before dawn the next morning, moving around the cabin with the lamp, looking at it differently than she had before. Not as shelter, as a structure built by a man who hid things. The foundation of the cabin was stone, old stone, serious stone, laid by someone who intended the building to last. She had noted it on her first day as evidence that the cabin had once mattered to someone, regardless of its current condition. She started at the northeast corner and worked methodically around the interior perimeter, pressing, tapping, listening to the difference in sound. Most of it was solid. Most of it was exactly what it looked like. She was at the southwest corner an hour into the search and beginning to doubt herself when she found the section that sounded wrong. Not hollow, not like the trapdoor, but different. Denser than the surrounding stone in a way that suggested something behind it rather than within it. She marked the section with a piece of charcoal from the fireplace. She stepped back. It was roughly 2 feet by 2 feet, slightly lower than the surrounding foundation wall, slightly recessed. She went outside and looked at the exterior of the southwest corner. From outside, the stone looked continuous. It was good work or good concealment. She couldn't tell which. She went back in and picked up the pickaxe. What followed was two of the most exhausting days she had spent since the first week of trying to survive the winter before Elias died. Foundation stone is not like drywall. It does not yield to determination alone. It yields to sustained, precise physical effort, and it leaves marks on the person doing the work. Her hands went from dry and cracked to raw. Her shoulders ached in a way that kept her up the first night. She broke the handle of the smaller sledgehammer and had to switch to a technique using the pickaxe alone, which was slower and harder on her wrists. Boone lay in the doorway and watched her with what she could only describe as concern. "I'm fine," she told him, during a rest on the second afternoon. He did not look convinced. "I'm not fine," she admitted, "but I'm not stopping." On the second evening, the pickaxe broke through into empty space. Not a large space. Her arm went into the elbow, and she could feel the cavity was maybe 18 inches deep. She widened the opening enough to get both arms in and her head partway in with the lamp, and she saw it. An oilcloth cylinder, wrapped tightly and sealed with wire, sitting on the dirt floor of the cavity, like something placed there with care. She worked it free, carried it to the table, cut the wire with her knife, unrolled the oilcloth on the table with hands that were not entirely steady. Inside was a ledger, smaller than the ones in the vault. The cover had no number, no date range, just two words, handwritten in the same small, meticulous script. Phantom Ledger. She opened it, and the first page made her understand why Silas Vane had spent the last years of his life building hidden rooms and coded combinations and false mortar and concealed cavities in stone foundations. Why he had arranged everything so that someone who followed the trail would arrive here, at the end. The first entry named Gideon Rusk by his full name, not initials. His title, President of the Western Dominion Syndicate. His home address in Durango. His banking relationships. His connections to 4 territorial officials by name, with dates and amounts. And then, in Silas Vane's small, careful handwriting, a list of events. Not euphemisms. Not situations resolved or unconventional measures. Real language. What had actually happened to Anna Jensen. What had actually happened to the others. Names, dates, Gideon Rusk's direct involvement, and in 2 cases Silas's own witness testimony written out in full, the kind of testimony that a federal court would not be able to ignore. Clara read the Phantom Ledger from cover to cover without stopping. Outside, the forest went dark and the temperature dropped, and she didn't notice either. The lamp burned through and she replaced it without looking up. When she finished, she closed the ledger and sat at the table and put both hands flat on the surface and breathed. She had come to this cabin with $45 and a truck full of everything she owned, believing she had hit the bottom. She had been right about one thing. This was the bottom. But the bottom was not empty. The bottom contained this. Gideon Rusk had destroyed families. He had taken land and lives, and he had done it for 18 years without consequence because he had enough money to insulate himself from justice, and enough influence to make sure the right people looked the other way. Clara was one woman, but she had everything Silas Vane had spent years trying to ensure would survive him. She had Anna Jensen's locket. She had the Phantom Ledger. She was not going to stay in this forest. She pressed her lips together. She began to plan. She didn't leave the next morning. She wanted to. Every part of her that had been moving on instinct for the past 2 weeks was ready to load the truck and drive straight to Durango and find someone to hand this to. But the part of her that thought 3 steps ahead, the part Elias had always credited and occasionally been frustrated by, made her sit back down at the table and think through what she was actually doing before she did it. She had evidence. That much was certain. What she didn't have was any guarantee that the evidence would reach the right hands, or that the right hands existed in the first place. Silas Vane had believed the territorial courts were compromised. His ledgers documented why. She had seen enough names connected to enough payments to know that Gideon Rusk had been buying protection for years, methodically, the same way he bought everything, with the patient application of money and the implicit threat of what happened when money wasn't enough. So she couldn't walk into the territorial courthouse. She couldn't walk into the county sheriff's office. The sheriff of Durango County was named 3 times in the vault ledgers, twice in connection with payments, and once in connection with a property dispute that had been quietly dropped after an overnight visit from men whose names were also in the ledgers. She couldn't go to the newspaper Silas had mentioned Anna Jensen contacting, because that newspaper had changed ownership 4 years ago, and she didn't know who owned it now or what their relationship with Western Dominion might be. She needed to know who to trust before she moved. and she needed to move the evidence before she left. Because if something happened to her on the road and she hadn't made copies or arranged safekeeping, then everything Silas had built and everything Clara had found would disappear with her. She spent the morning working through what she had. She made a second inventory, more detailed than the first, this time noting specifically which entries and which ledgers constituted the strongest evidence. She separated the materials into two groups: the vault ledgers, which documented the land fraud systematically and would be valuable in civil proceedings, and the phantom ledger, which named Gideon Rusk directly in connection with deaths and disappearances and would be relevant to criminal charges, if she could get a federal prosecutor to read it. Federal. That was the word she kept coming back to. Territorial courts, territorial officials, territorial newspapers, all of those were potentially contaminated. But federal authority sat above the territory, and the names in Silas's ledgers stopped at the territorial level. Whatever Gideon Rusk had purchased, he had purchased locally. He had not, as far as she could tell from the records, reached into the federal apparatus. She needed a federal connection. And she needed an attorney, not a territorial one. Someone who knew federal law and had actually used it against organizations like Western Dominion. She thought about this for most of the afternoon. Then she thought about Holt, her old neighbor, who was 70 years old and had been in the territory longer than most of the buildings. Holt knew people. He knew the history of the territory in a way that came from living through it rather than reading about it. She packed the phantom ledger separately from the vault ledgers. She wrapped it in its original oilcloth and put it in the bottom of her saddlebag beneath a change of clothes and Elias's survey maps. The vault ledgers she wrapped carefully and placed in a wooden crate she found in the back corner of the cabin, the kind used for dry goods, and she sealed it with tar. She heated on the fireplace and nailed the lid down with the nails she'd salvaged from the roof repairs. Then she dug a hole in the floor of the underground room, 3 feet deep, and she buried the crate. She kept the main ledger, Silas's account and confession, with her, along with the phantom ledger and Anna Jensen's locket. Those 3 things went into the saddlebag. The rest went into the ground. She refilled the lamp, latched the trapdoor, replaced the stone, and pressed the false mortar back into the seam as best she could. It wouldn't fool a determined search, but it might fool a quick one, and quick was probably all she'd get. She looked around the cabin one more time. It had been 11 days since she'd arrived. It felt longer and shorter at the same time, the way time works when events compress it. "Let's go," she told Boone. She drove to Holt's property the long way, adding an hour to the route by avoiding the main road through Clearwater. She wasn't certain she was being watched. She wasn't certain she wasn't. Caution cost her an hour. Carelessness could cost considerably more. Holt's ranch house was modest by the standards of a man who had been running cattle for 40 years, which told you something about Holt. He was on the porch when she pulled in, the way he often was in the afternoon, his chair tilted back and his coffee cup in his hand, watching the horizon the way old ranchers do. He straightened when he saw the truck. She got out. He came down the porch steps. He looked at her face. "How bad?" "I need your advice," she said. "And I need you to not tell anyone I was here until I tell you otherwise." He studied her for a moment with eyes that had spent 7 decades reading weather and cattle and people, not always in that order. "Comes inside," he said. She left Boone in the truck and followed Holt into the kitchen. He poured her coffee without asking and put it in front of her and sat across the table and waited. She told him most of it. Not every detail. She had decided before she arrived that she would not tell anyone the full content of what she had unless she was certain that person could be trusted, which meant certain in a way that went beyond liking them and beyond their word. She told him that she had found records in the cabin that documented Western Dominion Syndicate's land fraud. She told him that the records were extensive and specific. She told him that the fraud included her own property and that it extended back 18 years. She told him she needed an attorney who knew federal law and had actually fought corporate land fraud before. Holt listened to all of it without interrupting. When she was done, he sat with his coffee for a moment. "There's a man in Durango," he said finally. "Name of Amos Creed. He's a lawyer. Has been for 30 years, roughly. He is not what you would call likable. He is also not what you would call afraid." "Has he handled anything like this?" Holt tilted his head in the particular way that meant he was being precise. "He handled a case against the Territorial Railroad Commission 9 years ago. Land seizure, fraudulent easements, similar story to what you're describing except smaller scale. He won. Not quickly, not cleanly, but he won. He paused. He also drinks more than he should, and he will tell you that himself before you finish shaking his hand. I don't care about the drinking. I know you don't. I'm telling you because it's relevant. He has the kind of reputation that makes people underestimate him, and he uses that. He's sharper than he looks. He'll probably look like he's half asleep when he talks to you, and he'll remember everything you say word for word. Clara wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. Where do I find him? He has an office on Settler Street, second floor, above the hardware store. Holt looked at her steadily. Clara, whatever you've got, if it's what it sounds like it is, you need to understand what you're walking into. Western Dominion is not the Railroad Commission. They have more money and more reach, and from what you're telling me, they're not shy about removing problems. I know. Do you? She looked at him. Holt, I found their records. I know exactly what they do to people who become problems. She paused. I'm going anyway. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, in the way he had of agreeing with things he might also be worried about. You want me to do anything while you're gone? If you don't hear from me in 2 weeks, she said, get word to the Federal Land Office in Denver. Tell them a widow named Clara Mercer found records in Blackthorn Forest and was on her way to Durango. That's all you need to say. He wrote it down on the edge of a newspaper, which she found either touching or alarming. She decided touching. She drove to Durango. The city was larger than she remembered. She had been there twice before, once with Elias to register the ranch deed, once alone to file the estate paperwork after he died. Both times she had moved through it quickly, doing what needed doing, and left. She had never liked cities in the way some people did, the sense of energy and possibility they carried. What she felt arriving in Durango with a saddlebag full of evidence and no clear plan beyond finding one specific attorney was clear to the wariness of entering unfamiliar territory. She found a boarding house on the west side of town, run by a woman named Mrs. Parr, who asked no questions and charged $3 a night and had a small yard where Boone could stay without causing commentary. Clara paid for 3 nights in advance, which left her with very little, and carried the saddlebag upstairs herself and put it under the bed. She didn't sleep well. She lay in the unfamiliar darkness and listened to Durango settle around her. The sounds of a town at night, which were different from the sounds of a forest at night in ways she found more tiring than calming. And she went over what she was going to say to Amos Creed. The problem was simple to state and complicated to solve. She needed him to believe her quickly, because she didn't have time for a slow persuasion, and she needed him to take the case despite the fact that she had no money to pay him, and the opposing party was one of the most powerful organizations in the territory. She was asking a man she'd never met to go to war on the basis of her word and a set of documents he hadn't seen yet, against an enemy that had already demonstrated it was willing to make people disappear. She had 2 things in her favor. The documents themselves, which were, if Silas Vane had been as precise as they suggested, extraordinarily compelling, and the locket. She didn't fully understand why she kept coming back to the locket as a separate element, but something about it felt important in a way that went beyond its evidentiary value. It was not a document, it was a person. Anna Jensen had been a real woman with a daughter, and she had resisted, and she had died for it, and her locket had been preserved by a man carrying guilt he couldn't put down. And now it was in Clara's saddlebag, and someone needed to answer for it. She fell asleep holding that thought, which was not the most restful thing to fall asleep holding, but it was what she had. Settler Street in the morning was dusty and commercial, the hardware store loud with the sounds of early customers, the stairs to the second floor tucked down a narrow passage beside the main entrance. There was a door at the top with a frosted glass panel and a name painted on it in letters that had once been gold. Amos Creed, attorney at law. The second T in attorney was slightly chipped. She knocked. A pause. Then, "It's open." The office was the kind of organized mess that happens when an intelligent person has too much work and not enough space, and has made a separate peace with the situation. Bookshelves on 3 walls, every shelf double stacked. Stacks of papers on the desk, on the chairs, on a small side table. 2 windows that let in adequate light, neither of them clean. And behind the desk, a man who looked like he had been up since before she had, which turned out to be accurate. Amos Creed was somewhere in his late 50s, heavy in the shoulders, with gray hair that was making its own decisions, and a face that had logged considerable weather. He was wearing a vest over his shirt, and his jacket was on the back of the chair, which she took to mean he had already been working for a while. He looked at her over the top of a document he was holding. "Help you?" he said. Not unfriendly. Not particularly warm either. The voice of a man who had learned to pace himself on warmth. "My name is Clara Mercer," she said. "I was told you handled a case against the Territorial Railroad Commission 9 years ago. Land fraud and fraudulent easements." He put the document down, gave her slightly more of his attention. "I did. I have a case that's similar in structure, significantly larger in scale. Who are the defendants?" She looked at him steadily. "Western Dominion Syndicate." A pause. Not long. 2 seconds, maybe 3. She watched his face and saw what happened in those seconds. Not fear, not dismissal either, something more like recalibration. He was reassessing what he was looking at. "Sit down," he said. "Move those papers." She moved the papers off the nearest chair and sat down and put the saddlebag on her lap. "How large is significantly larger?" he said. 18 years, dozens of properties, systematic falsification of territorial surveys and legal documents. She paused. "And 6 deaths that I can connect to the organization's president by name, with first-hand witness testimony written by someone who was present." Amos Creed looked at her for a moment. "Where did you get this?" "A hidden vault in a cabin I bought in Blackthorn Forest. The cabin belonged to a man named Silas Vane, who worked for the syndicate as a surveyor and spent the second half of his life documenting what he had done and what they had ordered him to do." "Silas Vane," Amos repeated. "I've heard that name." "He died 5 years ago. He left the records deliberately hidden with what appears to be a deliberate system for someone with the right background to find them." "And you have this background because?" "Because they stole my ranch," she said, "and my husband spent years trying to prove the survey boundaries were wrong, and he died before anyone believed him." Amos was quiet for a moment. He had the quality Holt had described, the appearance of half attention that was actually complete attention wearing a disguise. His eyes were sharper than the rest of his face suggested. "What do you want from me?" he said. "I want to know if what I have is usable, and I want to know if you're willing to use it. You understand I'll need to see the documents." "I understand that." She opened the saddlebag. She took out the main ledger, the one containing Silas's accounts and the confession pages, and placed it on the desk in front of him. Then she took out the phantom ledger and placed it beside the first. She reached into the outer pocket of the saddlebag and placed Anna Jensen's locket on the desk next to both ledgers. Amos looked at the 2 ledgers. He looked at the locket. He picked up the main ledger and opened it and began to read. She sat and let him read. She did not try to direct his attention or explain what he was looking at. Either the documents spoke for themselves, or they didn't. He read for 40 minutes without saying anything. He turned pages with the focused deliberateness of someone taking in information rather than just moving through it. At some point he stood up and went to the window and read standing there for a while, which she suspected was a habit from years of reading in insufficient light. He went back to the desk, picked up the phantom ledger, opened it. He read another 30 minutes. Clara did not fidget. She had learned not to fidget a long time ago, back when fidgeting under pressure had cost her a negotiation she needed to win. She sat with her hands in her lap and watched the light change in the windows. When Amos put the phantom ledger down, he didn't say anything immediately. He picked up the locket instead, turned it over, read the inscription on the back, set it down. Then he looked at her. "Where are the vault ledgers?" he said. "You said there were dozens. These are 2. Buried in the floor of the underground room beneath the cabin. I didn't bring them with me because I didn't know who I was going to meet, and I wasn't going to carry everything at once." He nodded slowly. "That was smart." He said it without emphasis, as a simple assessment. "Can you use it?" she said. He exhaled through his nose, leaned back in his chair. "Miss Mercer, Mrs. Mercer, what you have here is, if it's authentic," he paused. "Let me not finish that sentence and start a different one. The question of authentication will be the first thing any opposing counsel raises, and it will be the first thing a judge considers. Documents found in a hidden location by an interested party are, I know how it looks," she said. "What I'm asking is whether the content, if authenticated, is sufficient." He was quiet for a moment. If the vault ledgers corroborate what's in these two, and if the survey maps you mentioned corroborate the boundary alterations documented here, then yes. The content is more than sufficient. Another pause. Gideon Rusk has never had his name on a document like this. No one's managed it in 18 years. Silas Vane managed it. He just didn't survive to deliver it. Amos looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. Not dramatically, but she caught it. He was a man who had been fighting institutional power for 30 years, and he had the kind of tiredness that accumulates from that work, but also the kind of stubborn vitality that explains why people keep doing it. "I'll be honest with you about my concerns," he said. "Please." The first concern is authentication. We'll need to establish Vane's identity as a former syndicate employee, corroborate his presence at the events he describes, and ideally find at least one living witness who can speak to the accuracy of the records. Do you know of any? She thought about it. The ledgers reference other people who were involved in the survey alterations. Some of those people may still be alive. Some may want to talk now that they're older. Maybe. Second concern is jurisdiction. Territorial courts are compromised, she said. I know, names and amounts are in the ledgers. Then we go federal, which is slower and harder and requires a different kind of case building. He tapped the phantom ledger. But this gives us a criminal hook, a federal hook. If I can get this in front of a federal marshal, the criminal investigation opens doors that the civil case alone wouldn't. And the land fraud, she said? My land. The other properties. Civil cases, federal court, running parallel to the criminal investigation. It's been done. It's complicated. He looked at her. It also draws a target on you. You understand that. I've had a target on me since a man in a black coat dropped an eviction notice on my porch, she said. I'm not interested in discussing whether I should be afraid. I want to know if you'll take the case. Amos Creed looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the two ledgers on his desk and the locket beside them. I'm going to need the vault ledgers, he said. I'll get them. I'm going to need the survey maps. I have them. And I'm going to need you to understand that this will take time. I cannot entirely predict, and it will require you to be available to answer questions, sign documents, and potentially testify, which will put you in rooms with people who have very good reasons to want this to fail. I understand. He nodded slowly. He didn't say yes yet, but his hand moved to the phantom ledger and rested on the cover, and she took that as a kind of answer. I don't have money to pay you, she said. I want to be direct about that. I figured. He wasn't bothered. I work on contingency for cases like this. If we win the civil claims, you pay me from the settlement. If we lose, a slight lift of his shoulder. I've lost before. I survived it. And if something happens to me before this gets to court? He met her eyes. Then we'll need to have made copies of everything and distributed them to people who can carry it forward regardless. He paused. I'd suggest we start that process immediately. She breathed out slowly. All right, he said. Now tell me everything, from the beginning. Don't summarize. I want every detail you can remember. She told him everything. It took most of the day. She started with the eviction notice and she went forward. The cattle sale, the horses, the land office, Holt's advice, the $45 cabin, Silas Vane's ledger behind the loose stone, Boone and the trap door, the vault, the combination, the ledgers inside, the entry with Elias's parcel number, the confession pages, the phantom ledger in the stone foundation. Amos interrupted occasionally, asking specific questions, dates, names, which entries appeared where in which ledger, how she had determined the combination, exactly what notation had been used next to the Mercer parcel. He wrote notes in a legal pad in a handwriting that was illegible to anyone but him, she suspected, possibly including him at certain hours. When she finished, it was late afternoon. The light in the office had gone golden and dusty. Amos put his pen down and rubbed his eyes. Mrs. Mercer, he said, I've been practicing law for 30 years. I have taken cases that other people wouldn't take. I have won some that shouldn't have been winnable. And I have also lost some that I thought I could win. He looked at her. I have not had a client come through that door with what you've just laid on this desk. Is that a yes? He almost smiled. Not quite. That is a yes. She nodded. She had not been certain until this moment that she'd been right to come here, to this office, to this man. Now she was certain. Not because he had said yes, plenty of people had said yes to things and meant nothing by it, but because of the way he'd said it, without theater, without the kind of confidence that lives on top of uncertainty and hopes you don't notice. He said it the way Elias used to say things he meant, plainly, with the full weight of what it actually cost to mean them. "I need to go back to the forest for the vault ledgers," she said. "How long can you hold the phantom ledger safely?" "I have a safe in the back room that would take a professional safecracker 20 minutes to get into," he said. "Under the circumstances, I'll take those odds. I'll be back in 3 days." He wrote something on the legal pad, tore the page off and slid it across the desk. "If you're not back in 4, that's the name of a federal marshal I trust. You can tell him the same things you told me." She took the paper. "Marshal Devlin," she read. "He owes me a favor from 9 years ago. He is also one of approximately 4 officials in this territory. I would bet my career on not being in Rusk's pocket." He paused. "Possibly 3, but I'm optimistic about 4. She folded the paper and put it in the saddlebag. She picked up the main ledger and started to put it back. "Leave it," Amos said. "I want to read it again." She left it. She picked up the saddlebag and stood. At the door she stopped. She turned back. "Amos," she said. It was the first time she'd used his first name, and he registered it without comment. "The people in the ledgers who became problems, 6 of them, Gideon Rusk resolved them personally. I read it. He's going to know someone is coming at him, possibly before we're ready." "Probably," Amos agreed. He didn't look particularly troubled. He looked like a man recalibrating for a known obstacle. "That's why the first thing I'm going to do tomorrow morning is file 3 quiet motions in federal court that have nothing on the surface to do with Western Dominion. Lines on minor affiliated properties. Small actions. The kind of thing that takes weeks to reach anyone's attention in an organization that size." She looked at him. "You want to freeze the edges before they know there's a fire," she said. "By the time Rusk realizes what's happening," Amos said, "he'll have 3 fires he didn't see coming and a 4th that's already inside the building." She nodded once. 3 days, she said. 3 days, he said. She went down the stairs and out onto Settler Street and stood in the late afternoon sun for a moment. Boone was in the truck across the street, his head on the door, watching her. She crossed the street and opened the door, and he put his nose against her hand. The plan was not complete. The plan had more moving parts than she was entirely comfortable with, and more uncertainty than she would have chosen. Amos Creed drank too much, and his office was a mess, and he would be going up against an organization that had been buying protection for 18 years. But he had read the Phantom Ledger and put his hand on the cover, and he had said yes the way people say yes when they mean it. She started the truck. She had vault ledgers to retrieve and a dead woman's case to finish building. She drove north toward Blackthorn Forest as the afternoon light went long and orange across the road, and Boone settled in the passenger seat, and the territory opened up around her, wide and quiet and full of things that had not yet been resolved. The road back to Blackthorn Forest felt longer than it had 3 days earlier, which Clara understood was not a matter of distance but of what she was now carrying in her head. Before, she had been moving on instinct and grief and the particular forward momentum that comes from having no good options except to keep moving. Now she had a plan, which was better in most ways and worse in one specific way. A plan meant she understood more clearly what could go wrong. She drove the long route again, same extra hour, same reasoning. She had told Amos she would be back in 3 days, and she intended to keep that, which meant she could not afford to lose the vault ledgers to a search of the cabin or to people who might have followed her into the forest. She watched the road behind her in the mirror more than was probably useful, because if someone was following her at a professional distance, she wouldn't see them anyway. But it was the kind of thing her hands wanted to do while her mind worked through the rest of it. She reached the cabin in the early evening. The clearing looked exactly as she had left it, which she recognized was not proof that no one had been there. She sat in the truck for 10 minutes before she got out, watching the tree line and listening. Boone was alert but not alarmed, his nose working the air through the cracked window. She had learned to read the difference between his alertness at new smells, which was just information gathering, and his specific stillness when something was wrong. He was doing the former. She got out, went inside. The cabin was undisturbed. She checked the trapdoor stone first. The false mortar was still cracked from her removal of it, but nothing had been moved. She checked the southwest foundation wall. The stones she had broken through and stacked to the side were exactly where she had left them, and the repacked cavity was intact. She let herself breathe. Then she went to work. Retrieving the crate from the underground room took most of an hour because she had buried it properly, and packing dirt settles faster than most people expect. She broke a nail down to the quick on the third shovelful and swore at some length, which Boone observed from the bottom of the stairs without comment. When she got the crate up and open, the ledgers inside were dry and undamaged, the tar seal having done what tar seals are designed to do. She carried them upstairs one stack at a time and laid them on the table. She counted them again. All present. She wrapped each stack in the oilcloth she'd saved from the phantom ledger packaging, and she loaded them carefully into the truck under the seat and under a horse blanket she'd kept from the ranch. She didn't sleep at the cabin that night. She had thought about it. The drive back to Durango in the dark was not appealing, and she was tired enough that fatigue was making small things feel large. But something about the cabin felt differently weighted now that she had taken the ledgers out of the ground. The intelligence that had lived here, all of Silas Vane's meticulous caution, had been built around the preservation of those records. With the records removed, the cabin was just a broken-down structure in the middle of a forest. That was fine. That was what it should be. But she found she didn't want to stay in it overnight without the thing that had given it significance. She drove back to Durango through the dark, with the vault ledgers under the seat and Boone asleep against her thigh, and she arrived at Mrs. Parr's boarding house at past midnight and carried the ledgers upstairs in 2 trips and stacked them under the bed with the saddlebag and sat on the edge of the mattress and looked at the floor for a while. She was not a person who typically acknowledged being scared. She was scared. She had been scared since the morning the man in the black coat walked onto her porch, in the background way that you're scared when a situation is genuinely dangerous and you're not built for pretending it isn't. What she'd been doing, moving fast, making plans, focusing on the next step, was not a cure for that fear. It was management. She was managing it. She took the locket out of the saddlebag and held it in her palm the way she had the night she found it. The oval shape of it, the weight. She thought about Anna Jensen deciding to write letters to federal authorities after her husband died, deciding to keep going even after she was warned. Clara had never met this woman and never would, but she understood her in a way that had nothing to do with the documentary record. She understood the specific stubbornness of a woman who has already lost the thing she was most afraid of losing and therefore has a different relationship with fear than people who haven't. She put the locket back. She lay down with her boots still on and was asleep inside of 3 minutes. She was at Amos's office by 8 the next morning with the vault ledgers in a canvas bag. He was already there, already in his vest, already with coffee, going on a small stove in the corner that she hadn't noticed on her first visit. He looked at the bag and then at her. "You look like you drove through the night," he said. "I did." He poured her a cup without asking, which she was grateful for. She laid the vault ledgers on the desk in stacks, organized by the numbering system she had established. He looked at the volume of them and was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said, "give me 4 days." "What happens in 4 days?" "I read everything. I map the corroborations. I establish which entries can be externally verified through public territorial records and which require the testimony of living witnesses." He put his hand on the nearest stack. "And I need to contact some people." "What people?" He looked at her with the slightly patient expression of a man explaining a chess move. "Mrs. Mercer, the land fraud in these ledgers did not only affect your property. You understand that?" "I know. Dozens of properties. Which means there are families who lost land, some of whom may still be alive, some of whom may still be living on reduced circumstances because of it. Those families are potential plaintiffs in a civil action. The more plaintiffs, the harder the case is to dismiss as a personal grievance from an unhappy widow." He said that last phrase without apology, which she appreciated. He was being accurate, not cruel. A case with 8 plaintiffs is harder to quietly bury than a case with 1. She hadn't thought about it in quite those terms. She had thought about the evidence, about the criminal charges, about Gideon Rusk and the specific wrong done to her and to Elias. She had not entirely thought about scale in the civil action. "How do you find them?" she said. "Territorial property records are public. The ledgers give me the parcel numbers and the approximate dates of the acquisitions. I cross-reference with the registry, find the prior owners, trace where they went." He paused. Some won't want to participate, some will be dead, but some will want to hear what you found in that vault. She nodded slowly. And the federal piece? Marshal Devlin? I sent him a letter yesterday. He said it without drama. I didn't give specifics. I told him I had material concerning criminal activities I believed warranted federal investigation and that I needed a meeting at his earliest convenience. He knows me well enough to know I don't send letters like that for small things. When will he respond? He's in Crestfall right now, which is 2 days' ride. I expect a response by end of the week. He looked at her. In the meantime, the 3 liens I filed yesterday morning are working through the federal court system. They'll reach someone in Western Dominion's legal department within the week, small enough that they'll probably be assigned to a junior person. They won't panic. They'll think it's routine interference. Clara looked at him. You're moving faster than I expected. You brought me Silas Vane's phantom ledger and a dead woman's locket, he said. I'm not going to sit on that. She drank the coffee. It was better than she made at the cabin, which seemed unfair given that she was the one who had access to a proper stove. There's something I need to tell you, she said. Something I've been thinking about on the drive back. He waited. If Rusk finds out that someone is building a case against him before we're ready, not the quiet liens but the real thing, he won't wait to see what happens in court. She kept her voice even. The Phantom Ledger names him in connection with 6 deaths. He's going to know that anyone who has that document is someone he needs to deal with before it reaches a judge. Yes, Amos said. So I need to not be the only person who has it. He looked at her for a moment. What are you suggesting? Copies, she said. As many as we can make, in as many separate locations as we can reach. So that even if something happens to me, or to you, or to this office, the evidence is already out. Amos was quiet for a moment. Not surprised. She could see that. He had thought about this too. Making copies takes time and increases the number of people who know the documents exist. I know. Both of those things carry risk. I know that too. She looked at him. But keeping all of it in one place carries more. He considered, tapped his pen against the legal pad twice, which she was beginning to recognize as his particular version of thinking out loud without speaking. I have a colleague in the Federal Land Office in Denver. Not a lawyer, an archivist. She's been there 20 years and she is not connected to anything in this territory. Could you trust her with a copy? I could trust her with more than a copy. I could trust her to understand what she was receiving and to protect it appropriately. He paused. I would need to write a very careful letter explaining the context. She can't just receive a package of ledger reproductions with no explanation. Write it, Clara said. Today, if possible. He nodded. There's a man I use for document copying. Careful, discreet. Knows that discretion is the reason I use him. I'll have him start this afternoon on the most critical pages. The Phantom Ledger first. Then the key entries from the vault ledgers. Clara set down her coffee cup. Amos, how long before Rusk knows something is actually wrong? He thought about it honestly, which she appreciated. He didn't give her the reassuring answer. Depends on how much he's already watching. If he pays attention to minor federal court filings, possibly within the week. If he doesn't, and organizations that size often don't, at the level of small liens, possibly 2 to 3 weeks before it lands on someone's desk who recognizes the pattern. So we have 2 weeks at the outside. Possibly, maybe a little more. He met her eyes. It's enough, Mrs. Mercer, if we move correctly. She thought about that. 2 weeks in which an organization that had been operating without consequence for 18 years would begin to understand that its immunity was ending. 2 weeks in which a man who had responded to previous threats by making people disappear would start looking for who was responsible. I'm going to be careful about where I stay, she said. I'm going to pay cash and not use my name. That's wise. And I want you to meet Marshal Devlin without me present for the first meeting. If Rusk has people watching you, they'll notice a widow who matches my description sitting in your office or walking into a federal marshal's building. Amos looked at her. You've thought about this more than I have. I've had more time with nothing else to think about, she said. And I'm the one Rusk has a direct reason to look for. You he might not know about yet. I'd like to keep it that way as long as possible. He nodded slowly. All right. First meeting with Devlin alone. I'll send for you when we're at a point where your testimony is needed. Don't send to the boarding house, she said. Send to Holt Kavanaugh's. His address is, I'll need that. She wrote it on the corner of his legal pad, and he tore the corner off and put it in his vest pocket. The next 4 days had the texture of waiting, which Clara was bad at. She changed boarding houses after the second day, more as a precaution than because she had any reason to think she'd been found. She moved to a quieter place on the eastern edge of the city, run by an older man who rented to travelers and asked fewer questions than Mrs. Parr. She kept the saddlebag with her everywhere. She kept the remaining documents under the mattress, which was not ideal, but it was the best she had. She spent one morning at the public library, which had a modest territorial archive, and she cross-referenced 3 of the parcel numbers from the vault ledgers against the official property registry. All 3 showed transfer to Western Dominion Syndicate affiliates within the time frame Silas had documented. She wrote down the prior owners' names. One of those names she recognized. Not personally, she had never met the family, but Elias had mentioned them once in the context of a story about a dispute over water rights. The Aldercott family, who had farmed the North Tributary for 20 years before apparently selling and moving east. The sale had always seemed abrupt, in the way Elias told it, but people sold and moved for all kinds of reasons, and no one had thought to question it particularly. According to the public registry, they had sold for a price that was significantly below the assessed value. In the vault ledger, the entry for that property noted, pressure applied through banknote, foreclosure threatened, resolved without escalation. Without escalation. Meaning the Aldercotts had given up without requiring unconventional measures. Meaning they had been lucky, in the specific terrible way that being financially ruined and forced off your land is luck when compared to the alternative. She wrote down their last known address, which was in the Eastern Register. She was still sitting at the archive table thinking about the Aldercotts and the 5 other families she'd identified when the library door opened and a man came in who made the hair on the back of her neck stand up before she understood why. She didn't look at him directly. She kept her eyes on the registry in front of her and let her peripheral vision do the work. He was large, well-dressed for this kind of library visit, and he moved with the economy of someone who had a specific purpose for being somewhere, not the aimless browsing of a person who had come in to read. He went to the counter and spoke to the archivist in a low voice. She couldn't hear the words. The archivist, a thin man who had been working here since before this section of the territory had a proper courthouse, listened and then pointed. Clara didn't see where he pointed because she was not going to turn her head, but she felt the man's direction of movement settle into something. She closed the registry carefully. She picked up her saddlebag with the same care. She stood and moved to the far shelf, keeping a bookcase between herself and the man's likely line of sight, and she spent 30 seconds pretending to look at territorial maps while she decided on the fastest exit that did not require her to cross the main floor. There was a door at the back of the archive section marked Staff. It was not locked. She had noted it when she arrived, the way she now noted exits when she entered rooms, a habit formed in the past 2 weeks. She went through it. On the other side was a short corridor and a door to an alley. She pushed the alley door open and walked out into the morning air and kept walking, not running, until she turned onto a parallel street and then another, and she was 2 blocks away before she let herself slow down. She didn't know who the man was. She didn't know if he had been looking for her specifically or for something else entirely, but she was not going to find out by staying in the building. She went back to the boarding house the long way and sat on the edge of the bed and breathed for a moment. Then she wrote a note to Amos. Unsigned, in indirect language that he would understand if he was following the same reasoning she was. She had it delivered by a boy she paid a nickel on the street, which was not a sophisticated counter-surveillance technique, but was better than going to the office herself. 2 hours later, a boy she didn't recognize knocked on her door with a return note. Amos's handwriting, equally indirect. Meeting confirmed for Thursday. Package sent north yesterday. 3 more families identified, 2 expressed interest. Come at 7 in the evening, use the back stairs. She read it twice and burned it in the ashtray on the dresser. Thursday was 2 days away. She bought food from a market 2 streets over, came back, and stayed in. Boone was in the small yard behind the building, and she brought him up to the room in the evenings, which the landlord had not explicitly prohibited. She slept better those 2 nights than she had in weeks, which surprised her. She thought about it and decided the reason was that things were in motion that she could not control, which meant that her particular brand of lying awake and planning had no useful material to work with, and her body had taken the opportunity to rest. There was probably a lesson in there. She didn't pursue it. Thursday evening, she went up the back stairs of Amos's building and knocked twice. The office was different from her first two visits. There was a man she didn't know sitting in the chair she had occupied, and the desk was covered not with stacks of papers, but with specific documents laid out in a way that suggested they had been arranged for review. The man stood when she came in. He was in his 40s, lean, with the particular unhurried quality of authority that she associated with federal officials. "Mrs. Mercer," Amos said, "this is Marshal Devlin." Devlin extended his hand. She shook it. "Mr. Creed has told me the outline," Devlin said. He had a direct way of speaking that she appreciated. No warmth performed for her benefit, but no coldness either. Professional, which was what she needed. "I'd like to hear your account directly." She sat and told it again. She was getting practiced at the telling by now, which was both useful and slightly disturbing. The way repetition smooths the rough edges off things that should stay rough. She was careful to keep the rough edges in. The man in the black coat, the horses, the $45. Boone scratching at the stone. She gave him the specific details because specific details are what distinguishes testimony from assertion. Devlin listened the same way Amos did, fully, without theater. He asked fewer questions, but the questions were more precise. He wanted to know the exact condition of the documents, how they had been stored, whether she had moved them, the chain of possession from the moment she found them to this room. When she was finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The Phantom Ledger," he said. "Gideon Rusk by full name." "Yes. Events described in a time frame that I can potentially corroborate through federal missing persons filings." He said it almost to himself. "Anna Jensen was reported missing. I know that name. Her case was filed at the federal level and never resolved." Clara looked at him. "You knew about Anna Jensen?" "I knew there was a missing persons filing. I didn't know the context around her death." He paused. "Or what Silas Vane knew about it." "It's in the Phantom Ledger," she said. "Everything he knew. And he was present when Rusk made the decision." Devlin looked at Amos. Something passed between them that was the professional shorthand of two men who had worked in adjacent areas of law long enough to understand each other without narration. "If the documents authenticate," Devlin said, "I can open a federal criminal investigation. That gives me authority to compel testimony, freeze assets under federal jurisdiction, and issue warrants regardless of what the territorial courts do or don't do." "How long to authenticate?" Clara asked. "Depending on what we find when we go through the full record, probably 3 to 4 weeks. I'll need to bring in a document examiner from Denver." He paused. "I'll also need to contact the Territorial Records Office in a way that doesn't signal what we're looking for. If Rusk has contacts there who flag unusual inquiries." "He does," Clara said. "At least 2 names in the vault ledgers work in the Territorial Records Office." Devlin's expression didn't change, but she saw his jaw shift slightly. "Names?" "In the vault ledgers. I can show you the specific entries." She looked at Amos. "Do you have the inventory list?" Amos produced the inventory she had made at the cabin. Devlin studied it. His finger moved down the column of names and stopped twice. "These 2, he said. He didn't say anything further about them. "You know them?" Amos said. "I know of them." Still no visible emotion, just adjustment, the recalibration of a man updating his map of terrain he thought he knew. "I'll go around them." Clara watched this exchange and understood that what she was seeing was Devlin absorbing a specific kind of disappointment, the discovery that an institution he worked inside had been compromised in a way that required him to work around his own colleagues. She knew that feeling from the land office visit, from the 3 attorneys she had called in the first hours after the eviction notice. The feeling of systems that should work not working, of the routes that are supposed to be clear being blocked. "Marshal," she said, "I need to ask you something directly." He turned to her. "If Rusk understands what's coming before you're ready to act, how quickly can you move?" Devlin thought about it. "I can request an emergency warrant from the federal circuit if I have sufficient probable cause. The timeline compresses to days rather than weeks if there's an imminent flight or destruction of evidence risk." He met her eyes. "Which means that if Rusk becomes aware of the investigation before we're ready, that's not necessarily a catastrophe. It might accelerate our timeline." "Or it might accelerate his," she said. "Yes," Devlin said simply. "That's the risk." She nodded. She had known this going in. She had known it in the cabin in Blackthorn Forest, sitting on the dirt floor of the underground room, and she had made the decision then, and she was not going to unmake it now. There's one more thing, Amos said. He had been quieter than usual for the last 20 minutes, which she recognized now as his way of letting a conversation develop before he added the piece he had been saving. He turned to Clara. Tell her about the offer. She looked between them. What offer? Amos glanced at Devlin, who gave a slight nod. 2 days ago, Amos said, I received a visit. A man I don't know. Well-dressed, polite. Said he represented interests that preferred not to be named, and that those interests were prepared to resolve any outstanding legal disputes with the Mercer estate in a private settlement. He paused. He named a number. Clara held very still. How large a number? Amos told her. It was enough to buy 3 ranches the size of the one she had lost. It was enough to live on for 30 years without working. It was enough that for one moment she was not proud of and was not going to pretend hadn't happened, she felt the pull of it like a physical thing. He knew my name, she said. This man. He knew your name, your approximate situation, and the fact that you had recently been in contact with my office, Amos said, which tells us that someone has been watching, not with full knowledge of what we have. Otherwise, the number would have been much larger, or the approach very different. He paused. But watching. She thought about the man in the library, the one who had come in with specific purpose and spoken to the archivist in a low voice. What did you tell him? She said. I told him I would relay the offer to my client, Amos said, which I have now done. She looked at the desk, at the vault ledgers stacked in their careful order, at the phantom ledger, sitting separate from the rest, the way Silas had kept it separate, preserved separately because it meant something different than everything else. She thought about the number Amos had told her. Then she thought about Anna Jensen, who had received warnings and not stopped, who had written letters to federal authorities after her husband was killed, because she had decided that stopping was not something she was prepared to do. Clara was not Anna Jensen. She was not going to pretend to a martyrdom she didn't feel. The money was real and her situation was real, and she was not going to perform indifference to what that number would have meant 3 weeks ago or what it would mean now. But she had seen Anna Jensen's face in a photograph the size of her thumbnail. She had read what Silas Vane had written about what happened to her. She had read it in his own handwriting, the fast, cramped script of a man who had been afraid for years and had done nothing, and who had spent the rest of his life building a system so that someone else could. Someone had to answer for it. No, she said. Not dramatically, just the word, flat and final, the way you close a door. Devlin was watching her. You understand that declining the offer signals to them that whatever you have is significant enough that a large settlement doesn't cover it. That changes their calculus. I understand that. It changes what they might be willing to do. I know. She looked at him. Marshall, what do you need from me right now that moves your investigation forward the fastest? He held her gaze for a moment. Then he reached into the jacket folded over the arm of his chair and produced a document. I need you to sign a formal statement giving me custody of the documents as evidence in a federal investigation. That triggers a legal protection over the materials that makes any interference with them a federal crime. He put the document on the desk in front of her. It also means that once you sign, the documents are federal evidence. No private settlement can make them disappear. She understood what he was telling her. Once she signed, the offer Rusk's man had brought to Amos's office became meaningless. The evidence couldn't be bought because it was no longer hers to sell. She was signing away the only leverage she might have had for a personal exit from this. She picked up the pen. She signed. Devlin took the document. He folded it and put it in his jacket with a care that matched the importance of what it contained. I'll have the document examiner here within the week, he said. I'll contact you through Mr. Creed when I need your testimony. He stood. Mrs. Mercer, you have done something I have been trying to do for 3 years without the right material to do it with. I want you to understand that. She nodded. She didn't need him to say it, but she noted that he had said it, and she noted the way he said it. Not as flattery, but as honest acknowledgement, the professional kind that passes between people who are working toward the same thing for different reasons. He left. She heard his footsteps on the back stairs. Amos poured 2 cups of coffee and put one in front of her and sat down. He looked tired in the specific way that comes from working hard in a concentrated period, not the general fatigue of a man who wasn't sleeping enough, though that was probably also true. The liens are having an effect, he said. I heard from a colleague in the federal court clerk's office this morning. Someone matching a Western Dominion legal counsel profile has been requesting information about the filings. Good or bad? Neutral for now. They're trying to understand what they're looking at. The liens are small enough that the instinct will be to treat them as routine and resolve them quietly. That's what I want. I want them spending energy on the wrong thing while Devlin builds the criminal case. Clara was quiet for a moment. She thought about what Devlin had said, that Rusk was changing his calculus, that declining the settlement would tell him something. Amos, she said, Gideon Rusk is going to come here. He looked at her. Probably. In person. He's going to want to understand what he's dealing with, and he's going to think that coming here himself, with the right kind of presence, is the fastest way to make it stop. Amos was quiet for a moment. You might be right. When he does, she said, I want to be there. Amos frowned slightly. Clara, that's not a meeting you need to be in. He's going to threaten you, she said, and you're going to hold your ground. But I want to be there when he realizes it's not going to work. I want to see that. She paused. And I want him to see me. Amos held her gaze. She could see him thinking through the angles of it, which was his version of pressing his lips together. If he comes, Amos said finally. When? She said. He conceded that with a slight tilt of his head. When he comes, I'll send for you. But you stay in the back room until I decide the moment is right. You don't walk in there on your own schedule. Agreed. He looked at her for a moment with something that might, in a different man and a different context, have been admiration. In Amos, it came out as a brief nod and the turning of his attention back to the documents on the desk, which was probably the highest form of professional respect he had. She finished her coffee. She picked up the saddlebag. The Phantom Ledger was now federal evidence. Anna Jensen's locket was federal evidence. The vault ledgers, all of them, every page Silas Vane had spent years filling with careful, damning precision, were federal evidence. Gideon Rusk had spent 18 years building an empire on land taken from people who had no recourse. He had done it systematically, patiently, with the confidence of a man who understood that power is not just money, but the arrangement of systems so that your money is always upstream of other people's options. He had not accounted for a dead man's cabin and a woman with $45 and a German shepherd who scratched at stones. Clara went down the back stairs and into the evening, and she did not feel triumphant, because she was not the kind of person who felt triumphant about things that hadn't finished yet. She felt steady, which was better. She had one more thing to do before Rusk arrived. She had to find the Aldercott family. The Aldercott family was not hard to find. That was the first surprise. Clara had expected the trail to be cold. People who have been pushed off their land and their livelihood tend to either dig in or scatter. And scattering usually means erasing yourself from records that might let creditors or complications follow you. But the Eastern Register had a current address, a farm outside a small town called Millhaven, 2 hours northeast of Durango, and when she drove out there on a Friday morning, she found the farm without difficulty and found Ruth Aldercott in the yard, hanging laundry on a line. Ruth was in her mid-60s, with the build of a woman who had been doing physical work her entire adult life, and the face of someone who had learned not to expect too much from the world and had arranged her expectations accordingly. She looked at Clara's truck pulling into the yard with the particular stillness of a person who has learned that unexpected visitors are rarely good news. Clara got out and introduced herself and said she needed to talk about the property on the north tributary that the Aldercott family had once owned. Ruth was quiet for a long moment. A shirt she had been about to hang stayed in her hands. "Come inside," she said. The farmhouse was small and clean and worn in the places that furniture and people wear things. Ruth's husband, Walt, was at the kitchen table when they came in, reading a seed catalog with the focused attention of a man who has learned to find pleasure in small, controllable things. He was older than Ruth by several years and moved carefully, the way people move when something has gone wrong with a joint and they have decided to live with it rather than make a fuss. Clara told them what she had found. Not everything. She had learned by now to calibrate how much a person needed to hear in the first conversation, and the full scale of the Phantom Ledger was not a first conversation thing. She told them that she had found documentation of how the Western Dominion Syndicate had acquired their property. that the acquisition had been the result of deliberate financial pressure manufactured by the syndicate, and that a federal investigation was now underway. Walt put down the seed catalog when she was about halfway through. By the time she finished, he and Ruth were both looking at her with an expression she recognized. The same expression she had probably worn when she read Elias's parcel number in the 7th Vault ledger. The specific look of a thing you suspected for years being confirmed, which is not relief exactly, and is not satisfaction, and is something that requires a moment to settle before you can respond to it. "We always knew," Ruth said. Her voice was steady. "We knew it wasn't right." The bank called the note the same week their man showed up with the offer, and Walt went to the bank to ask about it, and the manager wouldn't look him in the eye. She paused. "You can't prove something like that from not looking someone in the eye." "No," Clara agreed, "but you can prove it from 18 years of ledgers." Walt asked how practically this affected them. Clara explained what Amos had described: the federal civil case, the potential for recovery based on the fraudulent nature of the original acquisition, the process of establishing prior ownership, and the circumstances of the transfer. She was careful not to promise outcomes. She did not know what the outcomes would be, and she had made herself a rule against false comfort after the land office clerk's careful face had offered her nothing worth having. She gave them Amos's card. Ruth took it and held it in both hands and looked at it for a moment. "Is it dangerous?" Ruth asked. "For us, if we participate." Clara considered giving the kind answer. She gave the honest one. "There is some risk. The people involved in this have not historically been gentle with people who create problems for them. Marshal Devlin's investigation changes that calculus significantly. Once it's public knowledge that a federal criminal investigation is open, retaliating against witnesses becomes a federal crime on top of everything else. But before that point, yes, there is some risk." Walt and Ruth looked at each other. The look of people who have been married long enough that the look itself is a conversation. "What's your stake in this?" Walt said. He said it without suspicion, just the directness of a man who wants to understand the shape of something before he commits to it. "They took my ranch," Clara said, "the same way they took yours. My husband spent years saying the boundaries were wrong. He died before anyone found out he was right." She paused. "I also found a locket belonging to a woman named Anna Jensen. If you know that name?" Ruth's expression changed. "I knew Anna Jensen," she said quietly. "Not well. But she lived 20 miles from our old property. I heard when she disappeared." "She didn't disappear," Clara said. "She was killed. By the same people who took your land and mine." The kitchen was very quiet. "We'll participate," Ruth said. She didn't look at Walt this time. She said it, and Walt nodded once, and that was that. The Aldercotts were the second family. By the time Amos had spent a week working through the property records, there were 7 families identified and 5 willing to participate in the civil action. The other 2 had people who were too old or too sick or too far past the point of wanting to revisit any of it, and Clara understood that. Not everyone has the same capacity for this kind of fight, and that capacity is not a measure of anything except circumstance and energy and what a person has left. She didn't judge either family. She noted them and moved on. 5 plaintiffs, with Amos filing on Clara's behalf as the 6th, made a case that looked structurally different from a personal grievance. It looked like a pattern, which is what it was. The document examiner arrived from Denver on a Wednesday. His name was Garrett, and he was a small, precise man with magnifying equipment and a methodical approach that reminded Clara, in a way she didn't entirely dislike, of Silas Vane's handwriting. He spent 3 days with the Vault ledgers and the Phantom ledger, testing ink composition and paper age and handwriting consistency, comparing notations to known examples of territorial documents from the relevant periods. He was not effusive with his findings. He said what he found, in the order he found it, without editorial. The documents were authentic. Ink composition consistent with the periods indicated. Paper degradation consistent with the stated ages. Handwriting across all ledgers, including the Phantom ledger, consistent with a single author, consistent with an individual who had been identified through other records as a former syndicate land surveyor active during the documented period. Devlin received Garrett's report on a Thursday afternoon. On Friday morning, Gideon Rusk arrived in Durango. Clara heard about his arrival through Amos, who heard about it through a clerk at the hotel where Rusk took the best suite. The kind of arrival that doesn't go unnoticed in a city the size of Durango. Rusk traveled with two men who were described as associates, but who Amos noted were built like people paid for purposes beyond legal counsel. He had dinner Friday evening at the best restaurant in the city and made no attempt to be inconspicuous about it. He was a man who had spent 18 years being the largest presence in any room he entered, and he saw no reason to change that approach now. Amos sent the message to Clara's boarding house on Saturday morning. She read it, put on her coat, and told Boone to stay. She went up the back stairs of Amos's office building and let herself into the back room, which Amos had cleared of boxes and supplied with a chair and a gap in the door that allowed her to see and hear the main office without being seen. She had been there for perhaps 20 minutes when she heard the front door and then voices on the stairs. Rusk's voice was the first thing that told her what kind of man he was. It was not a loud voice. Loud voices are often the voices of people who are uncertain whether they're being listened to. Rusk's voice was quiet and accustomed to attention. The voice of a man who had never in his adult life needed to raise it to be obeyed. He came through the door alone. He had left his two associates downstairs, which she took as a deliberate choice, a calculation that coming in alone would seem like confidence rather than threat. He was in his early 60s, heavy but not soft, with the kind of groomed authority that comes from money applied consistently over decades. He looked at Amos's office with the brief, comprehensive scan of a person assessing a space, and his expression suggested the assessment was not impressed, but was also not dismissive. He was taking stock, not performing. He sat without being invited, crossed one leg over the other. "Mr. Creed," he said, "I appreciate you seeing me." "I didn't have a pressing alternative," Amos said. He was at his desk, his jacket on, which Clara had noted. Amos in his jacket was Amos in formal mode, Amos prepared for something. "I'll be direct," Rusk said. "There appears to be some confusion in the federal court system regarding certain filings connected to my organization's properties. I'd like to understand the nature of your interest in those properties." "My interest is representational," Amos said. "I represent clients who have claims against those properties." "What clients?" "I'm not in a position to name them at this stage of the proceedings." Rusk was quiet for a moment, not rattled. She could hear in the quality of the silence that he was not rattled. He was restructuring. "I had a representative visit your office 10 days ago," he said, "with an offer of settlement." "You did?" "The offer was declined." "It was." "I'd like to understand why." He paused. "Because the number I authorized was substantial," Amos said. "Yes, it was also declined." Another pause. "Is there a number that wouldn't be declined?" "That's not a question I'm in a position to answer on my client's behalf." Rusk looked at Amos. She could see his face from the gap in the door, the deliberate steadiness of it, the way he held still when most people would shift or blink. "Mr. Creed, I've been in this territory for 23 years. I've built an organization that employs 400 people and contributes substantially to the territorial economy. Whatever documents or records someone has presented to you, I would strongly encourage you to consider their provenance before you commit to a course of action that—" "The documents have been authenticated," Amos said. The room went very quiet. Rusk uncrossed his leg. "Authenticated. By a federal examiner, this week." She watched Rusk's face from the gap in the door, and she saw what happened there, which was not what she had expected. She had expected anger, or the controlled performance of non-anger that powerful men sometimes substitute. What she saw was calculation, pure and fast and cold, the internal machinery of a man who has survived for 20 years by being 3 steps ahead of everything, and who is now, possibly for the first time, receiving information that requires him to adjust how many steps ahead he needs to be. "What do you want?" Rusk said. He said it flatly, without the pretense of the previous conversation. They had moved past the territory where pretense was useful. "My clients want restoration," Amos said, "of the properties that were taken from them, or fair compensation for those properties at their current value, including the mineral assessments. They also want acknowledgement. I'm not going to acknowledge anything in a legal proceeding," Rusk said. Still flat. That controlled quiet. "That will be a matter for a federal judge to decide," Amos said, "given that Marshal Devlin has opened a criminal investigation." This one landed differently. She saw it. The name, Devlin, did something to Rusk's face that the authentication had not quite done. Because the authentication was about documents. And documents were a problem that money and lawyers and the right kind of pressure had solved before. A federal marshal was a different category of problem. Devlin, Rusk said it the way you say a word when you are deciding whether or not you believe it. He has copies of all relevant materials, Amos said, as does the Federal Archive in Denver. I want to be transparent with you about that, Mr. Rusk. There is no version of this in which the materials disappear. Rusk stood up. He did it slowly, not quickly, in the way of a man who understands that how you physically move in a tense moment communicates something and wants to communicate that he is not rattled, has not been rattled, and will not be rattled. He was good at it. Clara gave him that. He walked to the window and stood looking out at Settler Street. You have a client, he said. The widow, Mercer. Amos didn't affirm or deny. I have several clients, but the widow is the one who found whatever you claim to have found. He said it to the window, not to Amos. A woman who was evicted from a property under a legal covenant and then bought a cheap cabin in the forest. He paused. And she found, what? A dead man's notes. More than notes, Amos said. Rusk turned from the window. His eyes moved to the back of the office, to the vicinity of the back room door, and Clara went very still. She did not think he could see her. The gap was narrow and the back room was dark. But she had the sudden awareness of being looked toward, which was different from being seen but was not entirely comfortable. Tell your client, Rusk said, that I came here personally, that I made an offer in good faith, that if she wants a conversation, she's available now, Amos said. Rusk stopped. Amos looked at the back room door. Clara. She pushed the door open and walked into the office. She had thought about this moment. On and off for the past week, she had thought about what it would feel like to be in the same room as the man whose name she had first seen written in Silas Vane's careful handwriting, next to a list of things he had ordered done to people who couldn't defend themselves. She had thought she might feel rage or fear or the particular sick feeling that comes from proximity to someone who has done enormous harm and walked around for years in the ordinary world as if that harm were just the cost of business. What she felt, standing in the room with Gideon Rusk 3 feet away, was clarity, clean and cold and very useful. Rusk looked at her. She looked back. Mrs. Mercer, he said. His voice hadn't changed. I'm sorry for the difficulties you've experienced. No, you're not, she said. Not with heat, just factual. He held her gaze. She had the sense that he was recalibrating again, trying to determine what kind of person she was, what she wanted, where the lever was that would move her. That was how he operated, finding the lever. What would settle this for you, he said. Not the legal framework, you. What do you actually want? She thought about Ruth Aldercott standing in her yard holding a shirt, not moving. She thought about Walt at the kitchen table with his seed catalog. She thought about the 6 entries in the 11th and 12th ledgers and the phrase unconventional measures. She thought about Anna Jensen's photograph, thumbnail-sized, a woman and a daughter. I want Anna Jensen's name said out loud in a federal court, she said. By someone who has to answer for what happened to her. Something moved across Rusk's face. Not guilt. She didn't think guilt was a thing he experienced in the conventional sense, but recognition. The specific recognition of a man who has been carrying a dangerous secret for years and has just understood that someone knows exactly what the secret is. I don't know who, he began. Your name is in the record, Clara said. Silas Vane was there. He wrote down what you said. He wrote down the date and the name and what you ordered and what happened afterward. She paused. He kept Anna Jensen's locket. He wrote on the back of it. He kept it for 15 years because he couldn't make himself throw it away. And I think he couldn't throw it away because even a man who does what Silas Vane did has something in him that understands that a person is not a line in a ledger. The room was very quiet. Rusk looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his hat from the chair where he had set it, and he walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. You've made an error, he said. Maybe, she said, or maybe you did. 18 years ago, when you decided that the land was worth more than the people on it. He left. His footsteps went down the front stairs. Amos exhaled slowly. He had been very still during the exchange in the way of a man who is watching something careful happen and doesn't want to disturb it. Now he looked at Clara. You told him about the locket, he said. Not a criticism, an observation. I wanted him to know that we have it, she said. And I wanted to see his face when I said her name. She paused. He's been saying her name in his own head for 15 years. I wanted him to have to hear it out loud from someone else. Amos was quiet for a moment. He'll move fast now. Devlin needs to move faster, she said. Can you reach him today? I'll send a wire in the next 10 minutes. Devlin moved fast. The warrant for Gideon Rusk was issued on a Tuesday morning, 8 days after the meeting in Amos's office. The authentication report, the signed statement from Clara, the corroborating territorial records, and the specific entries in the Phantom Ledger connecting Rusk by name and date to the deaths of Anna Jensen and 2 others were sufficient for the federal circuit judge to issue it without the extended deliberation that most warrants required. The arrest happened in the lobby of Rusk's hotel. Clara heard about it secondhand through Amos, who heard it from Devlin. Rusk had apparently been on his way out, bags packed, travel arrangements made, the kind of organized departure that happens when a careful man understands that his window for a controlled exit is closing. The marshal's deputies met him at the door. He did not resist. That surprised people who knew his reputation, but Clara thought she understood it. Gideon Rusk was not a man who solved problems with his hands. He solved them with systems, with money, with leverage, with the arrangement of circumstances so that other people did the difficult and dangerous things while he remained insulated and orderly. When the system failed, there was no backup in him for the other kind of resistance. The news spread through Durango by noon. By evening, it had reached the territorial papers, and by morning, it was on the wire services. Western Dominion Syndicate's investors began withdrawing within the week. Not all at once, these things never happen all at once, but steadily, the way water finds a downward path. The organization had been built on confidence as much as on assets, and confidence is not a durable material. When the person at the center of it is in federal custody facing charges that get read into the record in a federal court and therefore become public, the assets were frozen, the mining operations stopped, the railroad contracts went into dispute. The network of officials who had received payments from the ledgers went very quiet and began, Clara imagined, the particular kind of inventory taking that happens when people who have been protected by proximity to power suddenly understand that the protection is gone. The trial took 7 months. That was shorter than Amos had expected and longer than Clara had hoped, which was how most things work out. She was in Durango for most of it, staying in a rented room she paid for monthly, working odd jobs, bookkeeping, mostly, for 2 small businesses whose owners needed someone who could add a column of numbers without losing track of the middle. She was not good at idleness, and she was not going to spend 7 months in a rented room waiting, so she worked and she attended the proceedings when Amos told her she should, and stayed away when he told her she shouldn't. The vault ledgers were entered into evidence. The Phantom Ledger was entered into evidence. Garrett, the document examiner, testified for 2 full days about the authentication process, methodical and precise, the same quality and testimony that he had in practice. 3 of the 5 families Clara had found testified about the circumstances of their property transfers. Ruth Aldercott testified for 90 minutes in a clear, steady voice about the banknote that had been called the same week the syndicate's man arrived with an offer, and the way the bank manager had not looked at Walt's eyes. Devlin testified about the federal missing persons filing for Anna Jensen and the investigation that had never been resolved, and about the specific entries in the Phantom Ledger that connected Rusk's instructions to the circumstances of her death. He testified about 2 other cases as well, where the Phantom Ledger's accounts had been corroborated by physical evidence his investigation had uncovered in the months between the arrest and the trial. Elias's survey maps were entered into evidence. A territorial survey expert hired by Amos spent an afternoon explaining, in language the jury could follow, what the boundary alterations had meant in practical terms, which ground had been removed from the Mercer property, what minerals ran beneath that ground, what those minerals had been worth and what they were worth now. Clara testified on a Thursday. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything, by sitting with the material until it was completely familiar and then setting the preparation aside and deciding she would simply tell the truth in the order it happened. She was not a natural public speaker. She was not comfortable with the size of the courtroom or the quality of attention from the gallery, which was full on the day she testified. She pressed her lips together more than usual, and she answered questions with the same flatness she used for everything, which the defense attorney attempted twice to characterize as coldness, and which the jury, Amos told her afterward, had apparently read as the opposite. She described finding the trap door. She described the vault. She described Silas Vane's careful handwriting and what it had said about the Mercer parcel and what it had said about Anna Jensen. She described the phantom ledger in its oilcloth wrapping inside the stone foundation. She described Elias, not at length, because it was not easy, and she was not going to cry in this courtroom in front of these people, not because she was ashamed of it, but because she needed to finish the testimony. She described him briefly, in the way you describe someone you have loved and lost, by the things they were right about that no one believed at the time. She placed Anna Jensen's locket on the evidence table herself. She had asked Amos if she could do this, and he had arranged it. The locket sat in its small evidence bag on the table, and she pointed to it, and she said its owner's name, and she said what was written on the back. AJ. Do not let them win. The courtroom was quiet. Gideon Rusk was convicted on 11 counts, 3 counts of criminal conspiracy for the land fraud scheme, 2 counts of fraud against the territorial registry, and 6 counts that Clara had not expected the prosecution to secure, but that Devlin had worked toward from the beginning, connected to the deaths documented in the Phantom Ledger. They were not murder charges. The direct evidence for that, after 15 years, was not sufficient. They were conspiracy to commit murder charges, which required a different evidentiary standard and which Devlin had built painstakingly from the ledger entries and from 2 men who had worked for Rusk during the relevant period, and who, in the months since his arrest, had decided that their loyalty to a man in federal custody had a natural expiration point. The sentence was the maximum the law allowed. Rusk received it without visible reaction, which was consistent with what Clara knew of him. He sat and heard the verdict in the same ordered stillness he had brought into Amos's office, and she watched his face and found nothing she recognized as remorse, which she had not expected to find and therefore was not disappointed by. What she found, in the brief moment before the deputies moved to escort him out, was his eyes moving across the gallery and finding her. He looked at her. She looked back. She did not look away first, neither did he. They held each other's gaze for perhaps 4 seconds, and then the deputies moved and he was gone, and she turned back to the front of the courtroom and put her hands in her lap and breathed slowly. The civil settlements took another 4 months to work through, which Amos had warned her about and which was still frustrating, because the pattern of a fraud case is that the dramatic moment, the verdict, the conviction, the newspaper headlines, comes well before the practical resolution. Justice and paperwork do not move on the same schedule. The 6 plaintiff families received varying settlements based on the assessed value of their original properties and the circumstances of the fraudulent transfers. The Aldercotts received an amount that allowed Walt and Ruth to retire the mortgage on their current farm with enough left to be comfortable without being wealthy, which Ruth said on the phone to Clara was more than she had expected and less than she had lost, which seemed to her like an accurate accounting. Clara's settlement was larger. The mineral rights beneath the eastern boundary of the Mercer Ranch, the 340 yards of corridor that had been the whole point of the alteration, the ground that Elias had walked over and measured and argued about, were restored to her ownership. The assessed value of those rights, plus compensation for the period of unlawful deprivation, was a number she still had trouble holding in her head as a real thing. She sat with Amos in his office the day the final settlement figure was confirmed. He put the document in front of her, and she read it and looked up. "Is this accurate?" she said. "It is." She sat with it for a moment. "I don't want the ranch back," she said. It was the first time she had said this out loud, and she registered, saying it, that it was true. The ranch was the ranch she and Elias had built together, and without Elias, it was a place she had lived rather than a place she could go home to. She had known this for a while without having the occasion to say it. "You don't have to take the ranch back," Amos said. "The mineral rights generate income independently of what happens to the surface land. You can keep those and let someone else work the surface." She nodded slowly. "What are you going to do?" he said. Not intrusively, just the question of a man who had spent a year and a half in the business of her life and was genuinely curious about what came next. She thought about it. She had thought about it for months, in the background of everything else. The way you think about the future when the present is too full to give it direct attention. She had thought about Ruth Aldercott, holding a shirt in her yard and not moving. She had thought about the other families she'd found, and the 2 who had been too old or too depleted to participate. She had thought about the land office clerk with her careful expression, and the three attorneys who had told Clara there was nothing to be done. There are more families, she said, not connected to Western Dominion specifically, but the same mechanism: land covenants, fraudulent surveys, legal instruments that regular people can't afford to challenge. It's not unique to Rusk. He was just the most systematic about it. Amos looked at her. You're describing a significant undertaking. I know. You would need attorneys, plural, a structure that can support ongoing cases rather than a single action. I know that too. She looked at him. Would you be willing to anchor it if there was funding? He was quiet for a moment. She watched him consider it, not the idea, which she suspected he had already considered at some point in the past several months, but the practical reality of what he would be committing to. Amos Creed had spent 30 years taking cases that other people wouldn't take, on contingency, in an office with a chipped T on the door and books stacked double on every shelf. He was not a man who had built a comfortable life. He was a man who had built a meaningful one, which was different and sometimes harder. Yes, he said. Same way he'd said it the first time. No theater. She funded the legal practice with a portion of her settlement. The rest went into an organization that she built slowly over the following year with the help of Amos and Devlin and Ruth Aldercott, who turned out to have a talent for the administrative side of things that she herself deeply lacked. It was not a clean or quick process. Nothing about it was. The organization took cases. Not every case. Not all cases were winnable, and Amos was honest about that from the beginning. They could not take cases they couldn't reasonably fight, because losing weakened the organization's capacity to take the next one. But they took the ones that mattered, the ones where the mechanism was fraud, and the people being crushed by it had no other recourse. She found, doing this work, that she was not a natural administrator either. She was better at the part that required reading documents and identifying the exact point at which something had gone wrong, which was the same skill that had gotten her through Silas Vane's ledger in a dark cabin in the middle of a forest. She was worse at the part that required managing people and schedules and the particular friction of an organization that was always trying to do more than its resources comfortably allowed. She hired people who were better at those things and tried to get out of their way. 1 year after the verdict, she drove back to Blackthorn Forest. She had been back once before, briefly, in the months before the trial, to retrieve some tools she had left and to check on the structure. She had arranged for repairs to be done: the roof, the cracked windows, the soft spot on the north end. Someone had done good work. The cabin was solid now, in a way it hadn't been when she arrived with $45 and everything she owned. She walked through the rooms alone. Boone followed her from room to room, sniffing at corners, his nails on the repaired floorboards. The trapdoor stone was exactly as she had left it when she sealed it after removing the ledgers. False mortar packed back in, nothing visible unless you knew what you were looking for. The southwest foundation wall had been patched by whoever did the repairs, the broken stones replaced, the cavity permanently sealed. She stood in this main room for a long time. She thought about the 11 days she had spent here in the worst stretch of her life. The cold and the bad food and the work that left her hands raw. She thought about the night she had read the main ledger through and found the entry with Elias's parcel number and understood what it meant. She thought about sitting on the dirt floor of the underground room with Boone's head on her knee, saying out loud that Elias had been right. He had been right. He had known there was something wrong, and he had said so, for years, to people who had the authority to listen and didn't. And then he had died, and the wrongness had gone on existing without him there to keep pointing at it. Clara had pointed at it for him. She hadn't planned to. She had come to this cabin with $45 and no plan beyond survival, and the plan had found her in the form of a dog scratching at a stone and a dead man's ledger behind a loose wall. She was not someone who believed that things happen for reasons, in the organized sense. She had seen too much of how things actually happened, the random cruelty of it, the way good people died and bad ones didn't, the way Elias had been right, and it hadn't helped him. She did not look at what had unfolded over the past year and a half and see a design. What she saw was a series of decisions made by people under pressure, some of them cowardly, and some of them brave, and most of them somewhere in between. Silas Vane, who had been afraid for years and had done nothing except keep records, and who had kept the records anyway. Anna Jensen, who had not stopped when she should have, by any rational calculation, kept going. Elias, who had walked the eastern boundary line over and over and refused to accept that the measurement was wrong, just because no one with authority agreed with him. And Clara herself, who had bought a $45 cabin because she had nowhere else to go, and who had found, in the worst place she had ever been, the thing that changed everything. She went out onto the porch and sat in the chair she had dragged outside on the second day and had barely used since. Boone came out and sat beside her. The forest was quiet, in the particular way of old forests in the late afternoon. Not silent, but settled, the sounds of it continuous and unhurried. She had a meeting in Durango on Monday. A family from the Eastern Territory, a farming couple with 3 grown children who had lost 40 acres to a fraudulent water rights dispute 5 years ago and had spent those 5 years trying to find someone willing to look at their case. Amos had reviewed the preliminary documents and thought there was something there. He was usually right about that. There was also a letter from Ruth Aldercott on her desk at the office, with 2 names Ruth had heard from a neighboring family. People who had their own story about a land covenant that didn't feel right. Clara had not read the letter fully yet. She would read it on Sunday evening and be ready for the Monday meeting. The sun moved. The forest shifted from gold to gray in the way it did at this hour. She had not fixed the things that were broken about her. She was still not easy with people she didn't know well. She still pressed her lips together too much and trusted too little, and sometimes sat with something for too long before she said it out loud. She still had nights when she thought about Elias in the specific way that didn't help. Not the useful, honoring kind of memory, but the kind that is just loss, plain and without resolution. Those nights still came. She expected they always would. But she had learned something in this forest and in this year and a half of fighting something larger than herself, something she would not have been able to name before it happened to her. She had learned that the people who make things change are almost never the people who plan to. They are the people who were already in motion for other reasons: survival, grief, stubbornness, a $45 cabin because there was nowhere else to go. And who found, mid-motion, something that required them to keep going when they might otherwise have stopped. Silas Vane had not intended to change anything. He had intended to survive his fear, and failing that, to leave something behind that might matter to someone he would never meet. It had mattered. She sat on the porch of the repaired cabin in Blackthorn Forest until the light was almost gone, and then she stood, and she called Boone, and she walked to the truck. Monday's meeting wasn't going to prepare for itself.